precinct buzzed with activity, officers moving in and out, phones ringing, papers shuffling. The scent of burnt coffee and cheap cologne lingered in the air. Amid the chaos, Keanu Reeves stood against a cold concrete wall, unmoving. The silver crucifix around his neck caught the harsh fluorescent light, standing out against his dark shirt. His jacket hung open, damp from the rain outside, but he paid no mind to the chill. His expression was unreadable, distant, yet heavy with something unspoken. A group of officers huddled nearby, their laughter cutting through the room like a blade. One of them nudged his partner, nodding toward Keanu's necklace with a smirk. "Look at this guy," he muttered, loud enough for Keanu to hear. The others chuckled, their amusement growing. One officer shook his head in mock disbelief. "Still holding on to that, huh?" he said, voice dripping with condescension. Another mimicked holding a cross, feigning a dramatic prayer before bursting into laughter. The moment stretched, their laughter swelling, feeding off each other's smug satisfaction. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He simply lowered his eyes, his fingers brushing lightly over the cross. A small, quiet gesture. Yet in the weight of that silence, in the quiet dignity of his presence, the cruelty of their mockery became suffocating. The laughter rang through the precinct, but Keanu remained still. And though he did not speak, the sorrow in his eyes carried more weight than words ever could. The laughter echoed through the precinct, but something about it felt hollow, forced even. Keanu remained still, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the crucifix, feeling its familiar weight. He wasn't looking at them, yet they suddenly felt seen in a way that made their mockery falter. The officer who had been the loudest shifted uncomfortably, his chuckle dying in his throat. "Come on, man," he muttered to the others, forcing a smirk. "He's not even reacting." Another officer, the one who had imitated the cross, scoffed. "Yeah, well, maybe he's praying for a miracle." Keanu exhaled softly, not in frustration, not in anger. Just a slow breath, steady and calm. The moment stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then the precinct lights flickered, just once. A brief stutter, a blink of dimness, then back to normal. But it was enough. Enough to make one of the officers glance up. Enough to cause a brief pause in the room's constant movement. The air felt different now. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier. Keanu lifted his head. His eyes met theirs, not accusing, not challenging, just knowing. A chair scraped against the floor somewhere in the distance. A door creaked open down the hall without a hand touching it. The laughter had stopped completely. The officer closest to Keanu swallowed, suddenly aware of how quiet the room had become. His own breath sounded too loud in his ears. He glanced around, but nothing had changed. The precinct was just as it had been moments ago. Officers working, papers rustling, the distant hum of a radio. So why did it feel different? Keanu finally spoke, his voice quiet, steady. "You should be careful what you laugh at." No malice, no threat, just a statement. And yet it settled into their bones like a weight they couldn't shake. The precinct felt different now. The air was thick, not with smoke or the stale scent of old coffee, but with something unseen, something felt more than heard. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and though everything appeared normal, a strange unease settled over the officers. One of them, the one who had mocked the cross the most, forced a smirk, trying to shake off the discomfort. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Keanu didn't answer right away. He let the silence linger, let it stretch just long enough for them to feel it. Then, without moving, without changing his expression, he simply said, "You'll see." Another flicker of the lights, longer this time. The precinct's background noise, the phones, the murmurs, the rustling papers, seemed to dull. A strange static filled the air, just beneath the threshold of hearing, like a television turned to a dead channel. A loud crash from the far end of the room made everyone jump. A filing cabinet had tipped over, its contents spilling across the floor. Papers scattered, drifting like dead leaves. No one had touched it. One of the officers let out a nervous chuckle. That was just an accident," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Then a whisper, soft, nearly imperceptible. It came from nowhere, from everywhere. The officers stiffened, looking around. "Did you hear that?" One of them muttered under his breath. Another whisper, closer. Keanu remained still. He lowered his gaze again, fingers brushing the crucifix. His voice was barely above a whisper. You were warned. Then the lights went out completely, the precinct plunged into darkness, and the whispering became screaming. The darkness wasn't empty. It moved. It curled into the corners of the precinct like ink spilling through water, thick and unnatural. The once familiar room, the desks, the papers, the walls felt as though it had stretched, pulled into something deeper, something wrong. And then the screaming. Not human, not natural. A chorus of voices layered over each other, too many to count, too distorted to belong to the living. The sound wasn't coming from the room itself. It was inside them, burrowing into their ears, their minds. One officer stumbled back, knocking over a chair. "What the hell is happening?" he gasped, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. Another officer grabbed at his radio with trembling fingers. "Dispatch, we need." Static, no signal. The shadows twisted. From within the pitch-black, figures emerged, not fully formed, not quite visible, but there. Shapes that shouldn't exist, faces that had no features but were somehow staring. One officer collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. "Stop it! Stop the noise!" Another officer tried to reach for the precinct door. It wouldn't budge. The handle was ice-cold beneath his touch, his breath coming out in panicked bursts. Then, through the chaos, through the deafening horror, there was a sound. A voice. Soft. Steady. "Let them go." Keanu. His words sliced through the screaming like a blade. He wasn't shouting, wasn't pleading, just speaking, his tone calm, firm. The darkness paused. The whispering slowed, the shapes hesitated, the air held its breath. Keanu lifted his crucifix, letting it catch whatever dim light remained. The silver gleamed. Something recoiled. Then, like a sudden exhale, the darkness pulled back. The screaming vanished. The lights snapped back on. The precinct was normal again. The desks, the papers, the walls, all where they had always been. The only sign of disturbance was the scattered files from the fallen cabinet. But the officers? They weren't the same. They stood frozen, eyes wide, chests rising and falling in sharp, panicked breaths. One of them had collapsed entirely, shaking as he clutched his head. Another officer pressed against the wall as if trying to make himself disappear. Keanu lowered the crucifix, slipping it back under his shirt. His expression remained unreadable, tired, maybe, but not surprised. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one could. As the precinct door swung shut behind him, the officers remained where they were, their bodies drenched in cold sweat. None of them dared to speak, but they all knew one thing. They would never laugh at that cross again.